Nobody really tells you what this particular stage of life feels like from the inside, not honestly anyway. You get the greeting card version, the version where everyone assures you it's supposed to feel peaceful, well-earned, a long-deserved reward after decades of work. And for some people, I'm sure that's exactly true. But for a lot of us, it doesn't feel like that at all, at least not right away, and nobody prepares you for the gap between what you're supposed to feel and what you're actually feeling. A gap that can be quietly disorienting precisely because you don't have the vocabulary for it yet, and everyone around you seems to assume you're fine. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way." If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again. So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. I want you to picture something for me. You're standing in a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of errand that used to take 12 minutes because your wife had a list and a plan, and a specific brand of cork she trusted after 30 years of experience with it. And now you're standing in the same aisle for 45 minutes because you can't remember which kind she always bought, and there's nobody to call to ask. And eventually you just grab the wrong one and drive home and sit in your truck in the driveway for a while before you can make yourself go inside. That's not a breakdown. That's not a moment anyone would look at from the outside and flag as a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. That's just a Tuesday, when the whole architecture of your daily life has been built around another person for 46 years, and then that person is simply gone, and you're left holding the wrong cork and wondering how a life that full got this quiet, this fast. My name is Wyatt. I'm 72 years old, and 14 months ago I sold a house I'd lived in for 28 years, put most of what I owned into storage or into the hands of people who could use it better than I could, packed 2 bags with what actually mattered, and got on a plane to the Philippines. I settled in a small city on the island of Cebu, about 15 minutes outside the city center, on a quiet street with flowering trees over the sidewalk, and neighbors who by the end of my 2nd month knew my name and my coffee order, and the approximate time I usually appeared on my front step each morning. I was 71 when I landed. I will be 73 in March. I have not once, in 14 months, woken up and wished I was back in Ohio. Before I get into exactly how that happened, if this kind of story resonates with you at all, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of this coming, and I don't want you to miss it. My wife Linda and I were married in 1977, in a small Presbyterian church in Dayton that neither of us had especially strong feelings about, but that her mother had chosen, and so that was the one we used. Linda was 24. I was 25. We had no particular plan except that we were quite certain about each other, which turned out to be enough to carry us through 4.5 decades. 2 kids, 3 houses, 1 significant financial scare in 2009 that we don't fully talk about even now that there's no we anymore, and about 1,000 ordinary Tuesday afternoons that I didn't understand at the time were the actual substance of a life. I worked as a structural engineer for the better part of my career, mostly commercial buildings, occasionally residential if the project was interesting enough. The kind of work that's satisfying in a specific, physical way because you can point at a building and know that the thing standing is standing partly because of decisions you made at a drafting table in 1994. Linda taught 4th grade for 31 years at an elementary school 4 miles from our house, the kind of teacher whose former students recognized her at the grocery store 20 years later and stopped her in the cereal aisle to tell her she'd been their favorite, which happened regularly enough that grocery shopping with Linda had its own particular pace to it that I'd long since learned to simply build into our afternoons. We had 2 daughters. Meredith is 41 now and lives in Seattle with her husband and our 2 grandchildren, a 9-year-old named Clara and a 7-year-old named Owen, who both have Linda's eyes and her particular way of tilting their head when they're deciding whether or not to trust what you've just told them. Our younger daughter, Paige, is 38 and lives in Columbus, close enough to where we'd spent most of our lives together that she and Linda saw each other most weeks for nearly a decade, a rhythm that made the distance feel theoretical rather than real. Linda got her diagnosis 26 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, caught at a stage where the options were limited in a specific, terrible way that oncologists explain with a carefully calibrated gentleness that you appreciate in the moment and that you replay constantly afterward, passing it for something you might have misunderstood, some alternative you hadn't quite registered in the initial shock of it. She lived 10 months past the diagnosis, which her doctor told us was actually longer than the median, a piece of information that sits in a very particular way when you hear it. Not comfort exactly, but something you grip onto anyway because it's there, and the other things you want to grip aren't. She died on a Thursday morning in early spring, in our bedroom, in the house we'd bought together in 1996, with Meredith and Paige both there, and me holding her hand, and the windows letting in a morning that had absolutely no business being as mild and light as it was. I remember noticing the quality of the light through those windows and thinking that it was the kind of morning Linda would have wanted to take a walk in, which is an absurd thing to think at a moment like that, and also is exactly the kind of thought that arrives unbidden when your mind is trying to find somewhere to put itself that isn't the specific, unbearable present. What the months after that actually looked like was this. I woke up, I made the coffee, always too much of it now because my hand still measured for 2 people out of 46 years of pure muscle memory, and I couldn't seem to correct it, no matter how many mornings I tried. I drank half the pot and poured the rest out. I read the news, or pretended to read the news, the words sliding past without leaving much of an impression, because concentration requires a kind of internal quiet that grief does not especially provide. I ate at strange times, standing at the kitchen counter more often than not, because the table seated 4, and eating there alone, had a specific quality to it that I hadn't developed a tolerance for yet, and wasn't sure I was going to. I did things to the house, the same way I imagine most people in my situation do things to whatever house they're left in, because being useful to a structure is easier than sitting with a silence that has no structure at all. I repainted the garage, which didn't need painting. I rebuilt a section of the back fence that was slightly worn but not actually failing. I stripped and refinished the hardwood floors in the hallway over the course of 2 weekends, and the floors came out beautifully, and I stood in that hallway and looked at them and felt absolutely nothing except the particular hollowness of having done a thing for a house that no longer felt entirely like mine, because the person who made it mine wasn't in it. Paige called almost every day. She did this carefully, out of love that was obvious and genuine, and she asked how I was eating, and whether I was getting out, and whether I wanted company on the weekends, and I said yes, to more than I wanted to, and still managed to say no to most of it, which she tolerated with a grace that I only fully appreciated later, after enough distance to see how worried she must have been. Meredith called less often, not out of indifference, but because she was 3 time zones away, with 2 young kids and a husband who traveled for work and a full-time job of her own. And our calls had the particular quality of 2 people, both aware that a conversation is standing in for proximity that isn't possible right now, and trying to make it count anyway. About 8 months in, Paige sat down with me at the kitchen table, the one I'd been avoiding eating at alone, and she put a stack of papers down with the careful, deliberate calm of someone who has rehearsed this enough to know exactly where the weight of it is going to land. They were brochures and printouts, senior living communities, a couple in Columbus, and one in a suburb outside Dayton that was apparently known for its amenities, which I understood to mean the activity calendar was more varied than most. Paige had done this research genuinely, out of love, because she'd watched me disappear into that house for 8 months, and she needed to be able to offer me something other than what I was already doing. I told her I would think about it. I looked at those brochures long enough to register their general shape, swimming pools and smiling strangers, and the specific visual language of a life that had been made safe and manageable and tidy. And then I put them on the counter with the stack of mail I'd been ignoring for 2 weeks, and I didn't pick them up again. I want to be entirely fair to Paige here, because the thing she was trying to solve was real. Something did need to change. The version of me that was drifting through that house, repainting things that didn't need painting and pouring out half a pot of coffee every morning, was not a version of myself that was sustainable, and she could see that even if I couldn't quite admit it yet from the inside. What she didn't have available to bring me was a third option. She'd brought me the 2 options she'd ever seen presented to someone in my position: stay in the house and diminish slowly, or move somewhere with staff and a calendar and call that a life. Nobody had given her a third option to lay on that table alongside the brochures, so she'd brought what she had, and I don't hold that against her for a single moment. The thing that actually redirected everything was a conversation that came from a direction I never would have predicted. My next-door neighbor, a man named Dennis who'd lived beside us for 11 of the 28 years we were in that house, had a son-in-law named Marco, who'd grown up in the Philippines, in Cebu specifically, and who'd come to the States for college and stayed, eventually marrying Dennis's daughter, and who went back to visit family there most years. Marco and I had probably exchanged 400 words total over the course of 11 years, the neighborly minimum that keeps a relationship functional without making either party feel obligated to do more than wave from a driveway. But in the February after Linda died, Marco came over specifically to offer condolences, sat at my kitchen table, the one I still wasn't eating at, and drank coffee with me for almost 2 hours. Somewhere in that conversation he mentioned that his mother and her sister were both living comfortably in Cebu on what would be considered very modest incomes in the States, that the climate was warm but manageable, that the people were, in his words, almost embarrassingly welcoming to foreigners, who came with respect and basic courtesy, and that the cost of living was low enough that a retired American with even a modest pension or social security could live genuinely well there, rather than carefully, which is a distinction that mattered more to me than I'd expected it to. I hadn't been poor after the house sold, but I also hadn't been the kind of financially comfortable that makes every decision feel unconstricted, and the prospect of a place where my income would translate into actual spaciousness rather than careful management had a pull to it I didn't fully recognize until later. I didn't do anything about it for almost 3 months, but I thought about it, late at night, in the specific insomnia of a person who used to sleep next to someone for 46 years and now sleeps in a bed that's become a reminder of its own vacancy. I started reading forum posts from expats who'd made similar moves, not all of them, not even most of them, particularly in my situation, but enough of them to suggest a pattern. People who'd arrived in the Philippines with some private doubt about whether they were doing something foolish, and who'd come out on the other side of the first year, saying something closer to the opposite. I read about the retirement visa, the special resident retirees visa, which turned out to be simpler to navigate than I'd assumed. I read about healthcare, specifically and carefully, because I was not going to make this move without understanding exactly what I was stepping into on that front. I read about Cebu, its size, its climate, its particular personality as a city, the way people who lived there described it in terms that sounded specific and lived in rather than promotional. Eventually I called Marco, which required a small, deliberate crossing of the invisible boundary we'd maintained for 11 years, and asked him flat out whether he thought it was a genuinely viable thing to do, or whether the version of it I'd been reading about late at night was optimistic in the specific way that the internet tends to be optimistic about things that are actually more. The reaction I got when I first shared what I was planning was more measured than I expected, mostly because by the time I actually said it out loud, I'd already done enough of the groundwork to answer the hard questions, instead of just presenting a feeling and asking for blind trust. There was worry, understandably, the kind of worry that comes from someone who loves you and is trying to picture every way this could go wrong before it happens. I didn't dismiss any of it. I answered what I could answer honestly, admitted what I genuinely didn't know yet, and didn't pretend the whole plan was without real risk, because pretending that would have been its own kind of dishonesty, and I think dishonesty tends to earn less trust than honest uncertainty does, even when the uncertainty is uncomfortable to sit with. Eventually, after a long, quiet pause on the other end of the conversation, I got something short but real, an acknowledgement that fell somewhere between reluctant and genuinely supportive, and I understood, even in that moment, that it was enough, that I wasn't going to get full enthusiasm right away and didn't need it to move forward with something I already knew, deep down, I needed to do. What mattered more than that first conversation, in the end, was what came later, once there was actual evidence to look at instead of just a plan and a promise. Skepticism, I've learned, rarely gets talked out of itself. It gets shown over time through actual results, until eventually it quietly gives way on its own, without anyone needing to win an argument about it. Complicated. Marco was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've held on to since, that the Philippines he knew wasn't a place that made life easier in the way a modern Western city tries to make life easier, with efficiency and systems and the reduction of friction, but that it made life fuller in a way that he didn't have a clean word for in English. Something about the texture of human contact there, the way people existed in relation to each other rather than alongside each other, that was genuinely different from anything he'd encountered in 20 years of living in the States. He offered to connect me with his mother's sister, a woman named Tita Rosario, who lived in the area I'd been reading most about, and who, Marco said, had taken in more than one confused foreigner over the years and helped them get their footing without making them feel like a project. I told him yes before I'd fully processed that I was saying it, which might have been the first real decision I'd made by instinct rather than deliberation in over a year. I told Paige I was going for a month-long trip, a look around, nothing committed, nothing irreversible, just an old man taking a long trip somewhere he'd never been, to see whether the thing he'd been reading about at 2 in the morning had any resemblance to an actual life a person could actually live. Paige's reaction was layered. There was fear in it, the reasonable fear of a daughter who'd spent 8 months watching her father dissolve into a house that was slowly becoming a monument to something she couldn't fix. There was also a kind of relief, I thought, that at least the thing I was proposing involved a plane ticket and a destination rather than another 2 weekends of stripping floors that didn't need stripping. She made me promise to take my phone, to keep international service active, to call her within 24 hours of landing, to have Marco's aunt's number in 3 separate places, including a piece of paper in my wallet. I agreed to all of it, because none of those conditions were unreasonable, and because I understood that what she was really asking was to feel like she could reach me, which cost me nothing to give her. I landed in Cebu on a Thursday, stepping into an arrivals hall that hit me with heat and noise, and the particular energy of a Filipino airport, which is a distinct thing, controlled chaos with a friendliness underneath it that keeps the chaos from tipping into anything actually stressful. Marco's aunt, Tita Rosario, had sent a driver to meet me, a young man named Roland who was waiting at the arrivals gate, holding a piece of paper with my name spelled slightly incorrectly, and grinning with the kind of unguarded warmth that makes you feel, after a 20-hour travel day, like maybe the whole thing was worth the physical cost of it. Roland spoke enough English for the drive, which took about 40 minutes, to include a running informal orientation to the landscape, pointing out landmarks I wouldn't remember and neighborhoods he clearly loved, the kind of narration that told me more about who he was than about where we were going, which I appreciated. Tita Rosario met me at the small guest house she'd arranged for my first week, a clean, simply furnished room in a building she described as belonging to a cousin, which I would later understand to mean that in her extended family's geography, more or less every building within a 4-block radius belonged to some version of family, a web of connection that made the immediate neighborhood feel like a single extended household with unusually good property distribution. She was perhaps 65, with the kind of practical, watchful warmth of a woman who has organized chaos professionally for most of her life, who assessed me in roughly 45 seconds upon my arrival and then simply started solving the problems she'd identified in that assessment, pointing out where the best breakfast was, when the market opened, which moto-taxi driver to trust for longer trips, and which to avoid after dark. She did all of this in English that was better than my ability to navigate anything she was describing in Cebuano, and she did it with the efficiency of someone who's done this orientation before and knows which information actually lands on day one and which can wait. That first week was disorienting in a way I hadn't quite prepared for, even having read as much as I had. The scale of things was different. The pace was different. Not slower in the way people sometimes condescendingly describe places they find less developed, but differently paced, organized around different priorities than the ones I'd spent 71 years treating as self-evident. The sound of the street outside my window at 6 in the morning was not the sound of any street I'd ever woken up next to, roosters and motorbike engines, and the specific cadence of Cebuano being spoken quickly by two people discussing something through a window 2 doors down. A conversation whose substance I couldn't begin to guess at, but whose rhythm had a particular music to it that I found, unexpectedly, easier to sleep through than I'd found the silence of the house in Ohio, which always managed to be loud in the specific ways that silence is loud when it's filled with what's missing. I took walks, long ones, every morning, because I'd always walked with Linda, and the habit had stayed, even when the company hadn't, and because walking was still the version of thinking that worked best for me. Within my first week, I'd mapped the neighborhood well enough to stop getting turned around, had located the bakery that Tita Rosario had mentioned on day one, and that turned out to serve coffee at 7 in the morning to a regular cast of mostly local retirees and one market vendor who always arrived with flour still on her apron from whatever she'd been doing since 4. The bakery was run by a man named Mang Eddie, who was perhaps 70 himself, and who greeted new faces with a specific, evaluating look that softened only once you'd eaten enough of his bread to prove you had some sense. I apparently passed that threshold by my 3rd visit, because on the 4th morning he poured my coffee without being asked and mentioned, in careful English, that I walked like a man who was looking for something without being sure what it was. I told him that was more or less exactly right. He said he'd seen it before, and that it usually resolved itself given enough mornings and enough bread, which turned out to be one of the more accurate predictions anyone made to me in my first months there. I met Tita Rosario's neighbor, a retired pharmacist named Danilo, who'd spent 2 years in the States in his 30s, working a hospital job in California, and who'd come back to Cebu with a particular appreciation for both countries that gave him the kind of practical bilingual perspective I was hungry for. Danilo sat with me on his porch most evenings of that first week, and we talked, in the way of 2 men past the age of small talk, about the things that had actually happened to us and what we thought about them now. I told him about Linda. He told me about his own wife, who'd had a stroke 7 years earlier and recovered, largely, but not entirely, and who now lived with a limitation on her right side that had required a full reconstruction of how they navigated daily life together. A reconstruction he described not as a tragedy, which it might have been, but as a problem they'd solved together and were still solving, daily, which was another way of describing a marriage. What he said that I've held on to most was this, that the people he'd known who'd struggled most after losing someone weren't necessarily the ones who'd loved most deeply. They were often the ones who'd made the mistake of letting love substitute for purpose, who'd allowed another person to be the reason they got up in the morning, rather than the companion alongside whom they pursued their own reasons. He said it gently, without any implication that he thought I was guilty of it, just as a thing he'd observed over a long life of watching people grieve. But it landed somewhere specific, because I'd been honest enough with myself in the previous year to recognize that some portion of what I'd lost when I lost Linda wasn't just her, it was the organizing logic of my days, and that rebuilding that had to come from inside rather than from finding a container to put myself in and calling that a solution. I stayed 5 weeks instead of 4, calling Paige at the end of week 4 to tell her I needed another week, and listening to the particular kind of pause that contains a lot of feelings being sorted quickly on the other end of a phone call. I'd spent the second half of those weeks looking at longer-term rental options seriously, talking to other expats I'd been connected to through Danilo and Mang Eddie's extended networks, getting actual numbers on monthly costs, actual information on the healthcare infrastructure, meeting the doctor who'd eventually become mine, a woman named Dr. Evangelista, who ran a small clinic 2 streets from what I was already thinking of, privately, as my neighborhood, and who gave me a frank and thorough assessment of what serious medical care in Cebu actually looked like, including which hospital she'd recommend for anything requiring specialist care, and what the costs looked like relative to what I'd been paying in the States for inferior access with superior paperwork. I flew home and spent 4 months getting it properly organized, because I was a structural engineer for 38 years, and I do not do things structurally unsound, even when the thing I'm building is a new version of my own life. I worked with an attorney on both ends, an estate lawyer in Ohio, and a legal consultant in the Philippines, who specialized in exactly this type of transition, to make sure every document was correct, every account accessible, every contingency accounted for as fully as it could be. I set up an international health insurance plan that covered emergency evacuation, major procedures, and routine care, and I printed the policy documents in triplicate and mailed 1 copy to Paige and 1 to Meredith before my flight date was even booked, because I wanted the answer to exist before the question was asked in alarm. I sold the house. I am going to say that plainly, because I think people expect more ceremony around that sentence than I can honestly give it, because the house had already largely stopped being mine in the way it had been when Linda was in it, and because the larger ceremony of it had already happened, privately, over the previous year, in 100 small moments that I couldn't have predicted and couldn't fully describe. What I can tell you is that going through the contents took most of 6 weeks and produced a specific kind of exhaustion that is not physical, that sits somewhere behind the sternum rather than in the legs, and that the things I kept were few and particular. I kept a cardigan of Linda's that still smelled faintly like her, though I know that's partly imagination by now. I kept a small framed photograph of the 2 of us that her sister had taken at Clara's birthday 2 years before the diagnosis, an ordinary afternoon in Meredith's backyard, the 2 of us standing next to each other in the unself-conscious way of people who have been photographed together for so long they've stopped caring much about the frame or the angle. I kept the recipe box she'd maintained since before we were married, index cards in her handwriting going back to the 1970s, recipes she'd clipped and annotated and improved and then annotated again, a palimpsest of 40 years of Sunday dinners and holiday meals, and the specific Tuesday night pragmatism of a woman who could make a good meal from whatever was in the refrigerator without consulting anything. That recipe box is on my kitchen shelf in Cebu right now, and I have cooked from it more in the past 14 months than I did in the entire last decade we were in Ohio, because cooking from it turns out to be one of the ways I can feel closest to her without it being only painful. Paige helped me clear the house, both daughters actually, flying in for a long weekend that was one of the harder weekends any of us had navigated since the funeral. And we moved through the rooms in the way of people performing an archaeological excavation of their own lives. Each drawer producing something that required a decision that was also a small grief. Each closet containing the specific geometry of a life, shared by two people. For so long, the organizing logic was half instinct and impossible to fully reconstruct, now that only one of them was doing the reconstructing. We laughed sometimes. We were silent a lot. Paige cried in the kitchen, quietly, over a stack of school drawings that Clara and Owen had done over the past 2 years, that Linda had saved in a drawer next to the stove, with the same organizational priority as the oven mitts. I told her she should take those. She already had. The day before the movers completed the final clearance, I walked through every room by myself, slowly, because I needed to close each one properly in my own way before they closed for someone else for good. I stood in the bedroom for a long time. I said Linda's name out loud once, just once, clearly, into the room she'd last been alive in. Then I walked out, and I didn't look back at the room as I left it, because there are some thresholds you have to cross completely or not at all. Telling my daughters properly, in full, not as a trip but as a move, required 2 separate conversations, because Meredith and Paige process things in fundamentally different ways, and a joint conversation would have let each of them calibrate off the other's reaction, rather than landing on her own honest one. Meredith was in Seattle, 3 time zones away, already living at a remove from my daily life that made this geographically larger, but not necessarily relationally different, and she asked me, directly and without much preamble, whether I was running away from something or toward something. I told her I thought I was doing both, and that after enough thought, I'd decided that wasn't disqualifying. She considered that for a moment, and said she guessed that was honest, which from Meredith means she's accepted the premise, even if she's reserving full judgment until she sees the evidence. Paige's conversation was longer and harder, not because she was more opposed, but because she was closer, because for the previous year she'd been the one calling every day and meeting me for dinner and watching the slow erosion of a man she loved disappearing into the maintenance of an empty house, and the thing she felt most acutely was the thing I'd feared she would feel, that this was a loss that layered onto the loss she'd already been absorbing for over a year. I let her say that fully. I didn't try to argue it into a different shape. I told her the truest thing I knew how to say, which was that what she'd been watching wasn't me living. It was me marking time in a place that had become a monument to the life I'd had, rather than a space for the life I still had to live, and that I'd rather be genuinely alive, far from her, than genuinely disappearing close to her. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What if something happens and I can't get to you?" I told her I'd thought about almost nothing else for 4 months, and that the answer was that I'd built the best possible version of safety I knew how to build, and that the version of safety she was imagining, a father nearby in a facility with staff, wasn't actually as safe as it felt from the outside, because a life without something to pull you forward isn't safe. It's just controlled in a way that can look like safety until the person inside it can't be controlled anymore. She said that sounded like something I'd rehearsed. I told her that everything true sounds rehearsed if you've had long enough to sit with it. She asked, finally, whether she could come visit quickly before I left, not to argue me out of it, but just to have a last Ohio dinner. We had 2 dinners, actually. The second one I made from Linda's recipe box, a chicken dish Linda had made on winter evenings since approximately 1988, with notes in the margin that said, "Reduce the cream and more lemon than you think." And I sat across from Paige at the kitchen table I'd spent a year avoiding, and we ate a meal that tasted, in some specific and uncanny way, like being taken care of by someone who wasn't there anymore, which is its own kind of presence if you let it be. I flew to Cebu on a Tuesday in late October. One-way ticket, 2 bags, and a carry-on with the recipe box and the photograph and the cardigan, which I'm aware was logistically irrational, and which I did anyway. Roland was at the airport again, this time holding a sign with my name spelled correctly, which felt like progress, and which he seemed quite proud of as well. Tita Rosario had arranged a proper apartment this time, a 2-bedroom unit on the second floor of a building 3 streets from the bakery, with a small balcony looking out onto a street with a very large tree that turned out to be home to an extraordinary quantity of birds whose opinions about the morning I would become intimately familiar with over the following weeks. The apartment cost the equivalent of about $280 a month. I want to say that again, because when I tell people this number, they sometimes ask me to repeat it, not because they didn't hear it, but because they heard it, and their brain filed it under things that can't be correct and needs a second pass to accept. $280 a month. My property taxes alone in Ohio had been running close to $600. I mention this not to make it about money, because money is not actually the center of this story, but because the financial structure of my life there changed what was possible in ways that affected everything else, that allowed me to exist with a spaciousness of choice that I hadn't felt in years, to say yes to things because I wanted to, rather than after running a careful internal calculation about whether I could afford to want to. The first weeks were harder than I let on to Paige on our daily calls, and I want to be honest about that because I think the version of this story where it all falls immediately and effortlessly into place is less useful than the true one. I got turned around more than I expected in a city I'd already visited for 5 weeks, because there's a difference between knowing a neighborhood as a visitor and knowing it as someone whose mail goes there, and the second kind of knowing takes longer than it seems like it should. I made social errors I didn't understand until later, small things, getting the formality level wrong with someone I thought I was on casual terms with, misreading the texture of a conversation that turned out to be about something different from what I thought it was about, operating on American social assumptions in situations where they simply didn't apply, and having to work backward to figure out what had gone sideways. Mang Eddie at the bakery was, in the early weeks, both the most constant thing in my days and the most honest observer of how I was actually doing, in the way that service workers who see you regularly and care about you as a person rather than as a customer often are. He watched me with the same evaluating patience he'd shown in my first visit, and said things when he had something to say, and was quiet when he didn't, a ratio I found exactly right. About 3 weeks in, he told me, while refilling my coffee, that I was better than I'd been the week before, but that I still had the look of a man who was waiting for something to feel normal, rather than letting things be what they were. I told him I'd been working on exactly that. He said working on it was probably the wrong approach, that it wasn't the kind of thing that yielded to effort so much as to time and presence and the willingness to stop comparing everything to a version of life that no longer existed anywhere except memory. Then he refilled someone else's coffee and moved on, the way people who say actually useful things often do, without waiting around for you to finish processing it. Danilo's extended social world, which I'd dipped into during my initial visit, turned out to be considerably larger and more structured than I'd registered from the outside. There was a loose but consistent gathering on Friday evenings at a covered outdoor restaurant near the water, expats and locals both, the kind of mixed table that forms naturally in places where the foreign transplant community is small enough that you inevitably find each other, and local enough in its social habits that it integrates rather than segregates. I went to my first of these gatherings about 5 weeks after arriving and found exactly what I imagine most people find in rooms like that, a group of people who'd each arrived at the same conclusion by different routes, that the life they'd been living before the move had stopped being fully a life sometime before they finally admitted it and did something about it. There was a man named Gerald from Vancouver, a retired surgeon of 73 who'd moved to Cebu after his second retirement, having tried and abandoned a first one in Canada that he described as the most productive depression he'd ever experienced, because he'd never worked so hard at being useless. There was a woman named Shirley from Perth, 68, who'd moved after her divorce and had been there 6 years and showed no signs of any plan to leave, who told me over a plate of grilled fish that the thing nobody tells you about starting over somewhere you've never been is that the absence of a history is a gift you didn't know you needed. That every place where you've lived too long carries the ghost of who you used to be in it, and somewhere, with no ghosts yet, lets you just be the current version without constant comparison. I sat with that through most of the meal without saying much, just letting it work on me, which seemed to be what the table was designed for. There was also a Filipino-American man named Arnold, 59, who'd spent 30 years in the States, and then, when his American company offered him early retirement, had simply come back to where he'd grown up, which he described not as a return, but as a correction, a word that I found exact in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, but that has come back to me more than once since. He'd been in Cebu 9 years, had a small consultancy that kept him connected to the business world without demanding the pace that had quietly hollowed him out in his 40s, and who had, in those 9 years, built the kind of daily life that I could see from the outside was genuinely full, in the way that word is supposed to mean. Not full as in scheduled and structured and accounted for, but full as in the actual stuff of it had weight and warmth, and he couldn't get through a Friday evening table without 3 separate conversations pulling at him simultaneously. I'll tell you the thing that actually anchored me, because I think a story like this needs a specific gravity to it, rather than just a collection of lovely observations about a place. About 2 months in, Tita Rosario mentioned to me, in passing, that the Barangay Community Hall, 2 blocks from my apartment, ran a monthly public meeting where residents could raise concerns and get updates on local projects, and that the moderator, a young barangay official named Kuya Jerome, had been trying for a year to put together any kind of workshop on basic construction safety and home maintenance for the older residents in the area, because several incidents over the previous year had involved structural failures in older buildings that could have been caught early with basic inspection knowledge, but nobody in the local volunteer pool had the specific background to lead anything credible. I am a structural engineer with 38 years of experience. I walked into the barangay hall on a Tuesday morning and introduced myself to Kuya Jerome, who looked at me with the specific, stunned expression of a man who has asked for something and immediately received it and doesn't entirely trust that it's real yet. We spent 2 hours at his desk mapping out what a practical workshop could look like, what the language barrier meant for how technical we could get, what visual materials would be most useful, what the actual safety knowledge gaps were in the community, as he understood them. I went home and spent the next 3 weeks putting together something I'm genuinely proud of: visual guides, simple inspection checklists, the kind of distilled from experience practical knowledge that takes 38 years to accumulate and that turns out to translate across language barriers better than most purely verbal content, because it's about looking at physical things and understanding what you're seeing. The first workshop had about 30 people in it. Kuya Jerome had spread the word through the barangay network in a way that I later learned reflects a particular Philippine community communication style that is essentially organic and self-amplifying once it gets started, a kind of word of mouth that travels faster and more completely than any announcement system I've ever encountered. I stood in front of 30 people, ranging in age from late 20s to mid-80s, and talked about how to look at a building, really look at it, what the signs of structural stress look like before they become structural failure, what the basics of safe home maintenance actually are, what questions you should be asking before you rent or buy a property in an area that has particular weather risks. I did this through an informal interpreter, a young woman named Bia who was Kuya Jerome's assistant, and who turned out to have an extraordinary instinct for rendering not just the words, but the intent of technical explanation into something that actually landed. After the workshop, an older woman came up to me with B translating and told me that her son had been arguing with her for 2 years about a crack in the wall of her kitchen that she'd been dismissing as cosmetic, and she wanted to know whether I would come look at it. I went the following week. The crack was not entirely cosmetic. It indicated a foundation settling issue that wasn't immediately dangerous, but that needed monitoring and would eventually need addressing, and I wrote up a simple, clear assessment that she could take to a contractor with enough specificity to get a real answer rather than a vague and potentially expensive non-diagnosis. She looked at that piece of paper. B translated my explanation of what it meant, and she said something in Cebuano that Bia translated as, "I'll tell my son he was right," which he will find very surprising from me. I laughed genuinely for the first time in I'm not sure how long at something I wasn't sure was going to be funny until it was. The workshops became a quarterly thing, then monthly, and by the 6th month I'd been asked to develop a slightly different version for a local technical school that offered vocational programs in construction and maintenance. A version aimed at young people who were entering the trades and who, their instructors told me, often came in with practical hands-on ability but without the underlying diagnostic framework that separates a good tradesperson from an exceptional one. I spent 2 weeks redesigning the material for that context, and then spent a month teaching a modified version of it to a class of 22 young men and women, ranging from 18 to 26, and it was, without any qualification or caveat, the most engaged teaching experience of my life, including the guest lectures I'd given at Ohio State, twice in the 90s, that I'd thought at the time were the professional peak of my educational output. There was a young man in that class named Jojo, 20 years old, who sat in the front and asked more questions than the rest of the class combined, not to show off, but because he was genuinely, urgently, trying to understand everything I was saying as deeply as possible, rather than just enough to pass. He stayed after most sessions. We'd walk out to the parking area together and keep talking, me in English, him switching between English and Cebuano, depending on which gave him faster access to the idea he was trying to express, Bay sometimes joining us to smooth the transitions. He was applying for a government scholarship to study civil engineering, had the grades for it, had already passed the qualifying exam once, and was preparing to retake a higher-level assessment, and he had the particular quality of someone who is going to accomplish the thing he's set out to accomplish, regardless of what obstacles appear in the path, because he has simply decided that's what's happening. I helped him with the application. More than helped, I co-wrote the personal statement with him over 3 evenings at my kitchen table, the one I now eat at daily, alone or with company depending on the day, and in the drafting of it helped